the independent facilitator for the meeting. So again, it might be important for you to know that I am not an employee of the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, that is the Npca for short, nor am I an employee of any of the engineering consultants who've been retained to assist with this mapping initiative. The only bias I bring to the meeting, if you can call it a bias, is toward achieving the best result for us all, and that's what I will set out to do. Now, I'll introduce a few others in a couple of minutes, but let's talk a little bit about what it is that we are up to tonight. As you likely recognize, this initiative to update the floodplain mapping is important given that its outcomes will help protect both public and private property that is at risk from flooding, and more importantly, reduce risks to personal safety. And of course, managing flood risks begins with identifying areas that are flood prone. And of course, we received, as you know, a fair bit of rain yesterday, which really sets the stage for tonight's meeting. Now, the great news is that you are all in on the ground floor, so to speak. The work is very much in its early stages, and this meeting is part of engaging the community prior, and this is important, prior to any engineering work taking place. In fact, this is the first of 3 planned information sessions, and you'll hear more about the timing and the purpose of the other 2 just a little bit later. So let's talk about what we're up to this evening. Simply put, tonight is about introducing the initiative and making you aware of what it is all about. And this will include the opportunity to ask questions, but more than that, it's also an invitation to you to share some of your experiences living along either the creeks. In particular, your experiences during storm or other high water events. And we'll talk more about how we can do that and how you can share some of that information a little bit later. But more specifically, in terms of this session's agenda, in just a few minutes, we will get some opening remarks and some additional context from an Npca representative. We'll then move to an overview presentation covering a bunch of things. We'll talk about the watershed and its characteristics, that is the watershed area. We'll talk about what a floodplain is, what floodplain mapping is all about, why it's important, and of course we'll talk about how you can remain up to date with and plugged into the initiative through the Npca's project webpage. We'll also talk about the definition of a floodplain and the notion of a 100-year storm or flood event. And we'll hear about how the floodplains are modeled and the approaches to be used and the activities to be undertaken. Basically, an explanation of how the whole process works. And then following the presentation, there'll be an opportunity to share questions of fact or clarification, and as mentioned, some of your higher level experiences with storms and flood events as people who live along or close to the creeks. After the Q&A and comments discussion, we'll talk about next steps and other opportunities to stay engaged, and so forth. And by the way, the Npca invites you to visit the project website to review information and to stay up to date. And some of this will be on screen for you a little bit later, but just as a quick heads up, you can go to getinvolved.npca.ca as the main page, and from there you can branch off to the Beaver and Big Forks Creek floodplain mapping page. But again, the overall page is the getinvolved.npca.ca page. And of course, you can also contact the Npca's project manager, that is the Senior Manager of Water Resources. His name is Steve Miller. You'll hear more from him in a little bit, but just a heads up, his email address is smiller, so that's SMILLER @npca.ca. And of course, you can also just send comments through email, or you can send written comments by surface mail to the Npca at their head office, which is 250 Thorold Road West in Welland, Ontario. And if you don't have the postal code, it's L3C3W2. Now, to be respectful of your time this evening, we're looking to wrap up this meeting in its entirety by no later than 8 o'clock. We may not go that long at all. It depends on how many questions and comments there are. So we may be done somewhat before then. And again, just to be clear, tonight's meeting is focused on the Beaver and Big Forks Creeks Floodplain Mapping Initiative. The meeting is not about, any and everything that may bug you about the Npca or about living in the region. We are very much staying focused on this floodplain mapping initiative this evening. As I said earlier, at the end of the presentation segment, we will be inviting questions of fact and clarification and comments on our topic. And the Npca team will address as many questions as there is time for in this session. We'll also outline the range of opportunities outside of this session that are available to you for providing further questions, further comments, sharing some of your ideas, sharing some of your experiences, and so forth. I'll just note that some people did send some questions in advance of the meeting, and we will look forward to addressing them either during the presentation or in the latter Q&A part of the session. I do want to note, though, that the team is not addressing individual property or site-specific items today. These can be addressed post-session to the Npca project manager. Again, we'll introduce him shortly and we'll repeat his email address a little bit later. But if you have a very much, a property specific, address specific question, those we will not be dealing with this evening. So before we go on, a few words about the nature of this WebEx session. I know some of you are quite experienced. You've used WebEx many times. For others, this may be your first time doing so. So let me go through a few basics. First of all, this session is being recorded. And this is being done really for a few reasons. First of all, so that the Npca has a record of the event. So that will assist with creating their event summary. But more importantly, the recording can be placed on the project website for others to view who may not have been able to participate this evening. Now again, for those of you who have not used WebEx, I will briefly describe the functionality of this webinar. As an attendee in the webinar, you cannot be seen or heard by us or by anyone else who is participating. We invite you to please send us your questions or again, your comments about your experiences living along the creeks throughout the session by using the question and answer function. That is the Q&A function. You'll typically find it on the far right, on the panel at the far right of the bottom of your device. So if you put your cursor over there, hover over it, you should be able to see the Q&A function. If you haven't already opened the Q&A function, you can do that by clicking on the three dots icon, again, typically found at the bottom right of your screen. The Q&A function should pop up. And within the Q&A function, please ensure, and this is really important, please ensure that you select the Npca chat moderator as the person to whom you will be sending your questions. So again, send them through the Q&A function and be sure that they are addressed to the Npca chat moderator. That's really important. Questions will only be seen if they are sent to the Npca chat moderator. And again, this is your way of engaging with us during this information session. Our moderator will be queuing the questions to be put to our responder panel during the, again, question and answer part of this webinar. And if you have any technical issues, if you're running into any difficulties, please email them to, and I'll repeat this, Sebastian@skycomp.ca. That's Sebastian spelled as follows, SEBASTIEN @ Skycomp, that's SKYCOMP So again, technical issues, send them to sebastian@skycomp.ca. And for those of you who have chosen to dial into the meeting, in other words, you are using a simple phone and not a computer or web-enabled device, you'll be able to listen to the presentation, but of course you won't be able to share any questions because those are only being accepted through the written Q&A function. And if you happen to be following the presentation using a hard copy or a PDF, I'll invite our presenters to reference the slide numbers so that you can follow along. So again, if you have any questions about anything you're hearing in the presentation, or perhaps that's not in the presentation, but that is related to our topic this evening, please forward them through the Q&A function as they occur to you. Don't wait until the end of the presentation. Send them as they occur to you. Our Npca chat moderator will be happy to review them, and the earlier he gets them, the better for everyone. So let me introduce just a few people really quickly, and perhaps just before I do that, I will note that we are expecting a number of our esteemed elected officials to join us this evening, and also some of the Npca board members. I won't single them out, but I will say welcome to all of you and thank you for your interest in this initiative. It's very nice to have you in the virtual house, so to speak. I did, though, want to introduce a few key members of the team that you will be hearing from this evening, either as presenters or potentially as people responding to questions. And I'll invite them to each just for 4 or 5 seconds to say a quick hello so that you can put a face to the name as I introduce each of them. And let me start with a number of staff from the Npca itself. And we have Leilani Lee Yates, who is the Director of Watershed Management. Leilani, would you like to please say a quick hello?
Thank you, Glenn. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Leilani. And we also have Steve Miller, whom I've mentioned a couple of times. He is the Senior Manager of Water Resources and the Npca's Project Manager for the initiative. Steve, go ahead.
Thanks, Glenn. Good evening, folks. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Steve. And from a firm called WSP Canada that is assisting the Npca with this initiative, we have a couple of individuals. I'll introduce them both and maybe they can say a quick hello. First of all, we have Steve Van Haren, who's a principal with the firm, and he's the consulting team project manager. Steve?
Good evening. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm happy to give you a technical overview of things, and hopefully we'll have a wonderful session tonight.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And we also have Steve's colleague, who is Albert Zouge, who's a senior project manager working in the water resources area. Albert, go ahead. Albert, are you unmuted? Okay, we're having difficulties making a connection with Albert. Maybe we'll be able to hear from him a little bit later. But I assure you he is here and he's a keen observer and very interested in what all of you have to say. And of course, we have all of you, the members of the public, without whom this meeting wouldn't make much sense. So thank you again for joining us. So in the interest of time, let's move to our next agenda item. As mentioned, we're going to begin with some welcoming remarks and some additional context from the Npca. We'll then move right into the overview presentation covering all of the kinds of topics that I mentioned earlier. And we'll be hearing first from Leilani Lee Yates, again, the Npca's Director of Watershed Management, who will be followed by both Steve Miller and Steve Van Haren. And again, as a quick reminder, as questions occur to you during the presentation, please share them through the Q&A function. Don't wait until the end. We'd be happy to receive them as early as possible. And you can also share any brief overviews of your experiences living along either of the creeks. Again, in particular, during any storm or other high water events, the team would love to hear about those. That will help them as they move forward with this study. And for tonight, just keep your description short. Any really lengthy ones you can send post-meeting through the various email opportunities or other avenues available to you. But first, let's hear from Leilani. Over to you, Leilani, to start us off.
Thank you, Glenn, and good evening, everyone. The objective of the Npca is to establish and undertake programs designed to further the conservation, restoration, development, and management of the region's natural resources. One of our key responsibilities is to advocate and implement programs that keep the public safe from flooding, erosion, and other natural hazards. The Beaver Creek and Big Forks Creek floodplain mapping study is important work we're undertaking to inform updates to our regulation mapping and policies and our day-to-day operations as a resource management agency and regulatory authority. This information is also important to landowners like you to better understand where flood hazards exist on your property and where it's possible to safely build new buildings and structures. Before COVID-19, we would have been able to hold this session in person at a community center. And even though we can't meet in person today, we're still committed to hearing from you and welcome your comments. As Glenn noted, during the presentations this evening, we encourage you to submit your comments and questions in the chat function as they come to you. And if we're unable to address all your questions and comments this evening, please contact us and we'll be more than happy to speak with you. Thank you again for taking the time to join us this evening, and I look forward to our discussion. I'd like to now introduce Steve Miller. He's the project manager and senior manager of water resources at the Npca, who will provide an overview of the project. Steve, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Leilani. Once again, good evening, folks. My name is Steve Miller. I'm senior manager of water resources with the Conservation Authority. My presentation is going to focus on some very high-level things, some general questions, in order to set the stage as to why we're doing this, and then Mr. Stephen Van Haren of the engineering firm WSP would get into kind of a general technical discussion as to how we actually do this thing. So let me see if let me wrestle with technology and share my screen. Okay, I trust we can see that.
We can, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right. Let's jump into it. So our good friend Beaver Creek. Beaver Creek is a major tributary of the Welland River. It drains a good chunk of the central portion of the Township of West Lincoln, and it flows into the Welland River just east of Wellandport. We've got major tributaries of Beaver Creek itself, Black Ash Creek and Parker Creek. I've got a general schematic here as to the various tributaries of Beaver Creek, but you're going to see in WSP's presentation, they have one that's a little bit more refined. This one is really for presentation purposes. Now, south of the Welland River, we have another major tributary, our good friend Big Forks Creek, that drains most of central Wainfleet and some of the eastern portion of Haldimand County. Big Forks Creek flows into the Welland River between Wellandport and the central Niagara Airport. There's approximately 110 kilometers of watercourses to be mapped. And we compare that to approximately 74 kilometers of Beaver Creek. So we're looking at just over 180 kilometers of watercourse to be studied. Big Forks Creek was floodplain mapped back in 1986. The Conservation Authority, within the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority's jurisdiction, we have over 140 watercourses, and some bigger than others. Back in the day, back in 1986, the Conservation Authority did just what we're doing now. They took a look at Big Forks Creek, and that was great. But It's dated now. Just how dated? Let's have a little flashback. 1986, we see a sweet Corvette up in the top left. Meryl Streep's Out of Africa, won Movie of the Year that year. Paul Simon's Graceland, Best Album at the Grammys. 1986 introduced us to Chernobyl. And we have a state-of-the-art personal computer, circa 1986. A lot's changed since then, and we recognize that. We recognize there is now a need not only to update the Big Forks Creek floodplain mapping, but to provide new floodplain mapping for all those other watercourses that don't currently have floodplain mapping. So, what is a floodplain? Well, simply put, a floodplain is the land that beside a water course, a water body, a river, a stream, that during a severe storm event, when we have a lot of rain flowing across the landscape, so much so that it exceeds the ability of that water course to convey all the water, that water spills out over the banks and flows across the land adjacent to the water course, adjacent to the river. It is a natural feature, a natural process. Well, what is floodplain mapping? Floodplain mapping is an engineering exercise that identifies areas that are susceptible to flooding during a storm event. In this case, we see the city of Welland, the Welland River flowing through it, and you see that thick red line. That's the extent that the floodplain or the floodwaters have been calculated to get to during a big storm event. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this isn't something that is undertaken in all kinds of manners. There is a very prescribed technical process outlined by the province of Ontario as to how to do these kinds of floodplain mapping studies. If you're interested, it's online. It's a quick Google search, the Technical Guide for River and Stream Systems. This is used by all conservation authorities and all municipalities when they're undertaking floodplain mapping projects. So just why do we do this thing? Why is floodplain mapping important? Well, a couple of reasons. Municipalities, regions, they're looking to reduce the cost of flood damage. It's a thing, especially with climate change. We're seeing more and more of it. The first step to do that is to have mapping that accurately shows where the hazard is. These maps help folks to prepare for and respond to potential flooding. What I mean is to prepare for. If a first responder, a municipal fire department has an idea that Creek Road, Regional Road 45, Wainfleet, floods during a big storm event, they can adjust their emergency response route accordingly. And someone living, say, beside Bartlett Creek in Beamsville, if they have an idea as to how high the floodwaters get, they can take precautions to floodproof, to sandbag maybe openings in their foundation or low spots in their house in order to help safeguard their property. Those are just a few examples. So we talked about a major storm. We talked about flood, mapping the floodplain. Well, just what storm do we use? It's not just anything. In Niagara, the regulated storm event, the regulated flood hazard, is the extent of flooding that happens during the 100-year storm event. Another way of thinking of it is that's the storm that has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. Now, the magnitude of that storm depends upon where you are in the peninsula. The prevailing winds in Niagara are from the southwest, and typically the north shore of Lake Erie, Port Colborne, Fort Erie, Haldimand County, Wainfleet, receive a little bit more rainfall than the northern tier, the St. Catharines, the Lincoln, Niagara on the Lake. Depends where you are, but generally, it's 4 inches of rain. That 100-year storm will drop 4 inches of rain in 12 hours. So that's what the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority uses, that amount of rainfall hitting the ground, flowing across the landscape. We try and map to see the extent of that, to understand it. Now, are there bigger storms? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We see example of one, Hurricane Hazel back in 1554. Notice it dumped 11 inches of rain in approximately 12 hours on Toronto. Contrast that to the 100-year, the 4 inches, approximately 4 inches of rain that we use in Niagara. Many jurisdictions, especially in and around the Greater Toronto area, a little further north, still use the Hurricane Hazel event, and Niagara did before 1989. But that sterilized a lot of land for development. That seemed to be, because of the lay of the land, generally Niagara is flat. There are some valleys as we proceed north, but not as much as we get in around the GTA with the Oak Ridges Moraine, those deep valleys, the Rouge, the Humber. So the municipalities and the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority back in '89 petitioned the province to reduce it to the 100-year, which is still a valid storm event to use. And the province accepted that. So this is what we use today. At the end of the day, the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority is working to reduce the flood risk. And we do that by trying to understand where that flood risk is occurring, utilizing technical and defensible methods and mapping. We're looking to update old floodplain mapping and generate new ones where previous floodplain mapping did not exist. Now, I invite you to take a look at our website. Glenn indicated that it's on the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority's website. Here, we're going to have a recording of all our public engagement sessions. We're going to post all our draft reports for review by the public so they can ask questions. You can leave comments on this website. We'll be posting different the dates and times of the upcoming public engagement sessions. But I want to point out a cool little tool. You'll see it in that circled in red there. It's a little widget that our computer wizards put together. If you click on that, you'll go into a Google Maps kind of view, and it'll answer the question, is my house, is my property in the study area? You'll see the Big Forks Creek and Beaver Creek there. What we've done is put a 300-meter buffer on either side of those watercourses. So watercourse, and we've got a 600-meter buffer all told. That's not the floodplain. That's not the floodplain. That's simply the area, the general area that we're studying. So if you've received notice from family or friend that this floodplain mapping study is happening, you can use this tool to see if it does indeed impact your property or not. If it doesn't, then you have no further need to be concerned. I'll leave off this my presentation with echoing Leilani and Glenn's comments. We look forward to hearing about your observations and your experiences, because many of you have lived along these watercourses for many, many years. Feel free to reach out. If there's something that you feel is unique on your property that the Conservation Authority should know about, let us know. Give me a call, and we'd love to chat with you. Want to make clear that really no engineering work has started yet. No engineering work has started. We haven't gone out, taken any measurements, surveyed anything. And I want to assure you, our first blush at the air photos, it is indicated to us that all the major crossings that have the potential to impact the floodplain are road crossings. They're on municipal rights of way owned either by the township, the county, or the region. I will promise you there will be no one from the project team, none of our survey crew, no one walking around private property without the landowner's full permission. We will seek that permission should there be a desire, should there be a need to enter your property, but we will not do so uninvited or without your permission. So with that, I thank you for taking the time to listen to me, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Stephen Van Haren of the engineering firm WSP Canada.
Yeah, and Steve, actually, it's Glenn here again. If I can jump in just for a moment and beg the group's indulgence, we may have given you some slightly wrong information earlier, an email address that was off by one letter. So I just want to clarify for anybody who may be having technical issues, if you're trying to reach someone who can help you out, it is Sebastian with an A, not an E. So it would be SEBASTIAN at skycomp.ca. So again, that's Sebastian, SEBASTIAN at skycomp.ca. So glad that we could clarify that for you, and hopefully no one is having any technical issues, but that individual is available as a resource. So Steve Miller, thank you again. Over to Steve Van Haren now. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, Glenn. And for everyone, I'm pleased to be here. I'm going to start my presentation right now, and I hope that everything technically works out here. Looks like it's going to, or should work. It's opening. And so my presentation will overlap a little bit with Mr. Miller's, just because there's some of the content there that was very similar. But nevertheless, as Steve mentioned, my name is Steve Van Haren. I'm the manager of the water resources team at the consulting firm WSP. WSP is a national consulting firm with offices across the country, and we're part of WSP Global, which has offices all across the world. So I won't bore you with those details, but the fact is that my team and I, one of our services is floodplain mapping. And we are proud to be part of the team that provided the Welland River floodplain mapping. And by extension, we're very proud to be part of this team as well. The project will follow almost exactly the same methodology that we used, that was vetted and is available for peer review and so on. So it's a very transparent process, and I want to assure you that we're going to be following the exact same process here. So now I'm just trying to advance the slide. And I think, do I do it this way? Sure. Sebastian, this is having a bit of an issue advancing the slide.
We'll have someone give you a little bit of assistance, Steve.
Thank you. So, as we all mentioned before, the Npca boundaries encompass quite a bit of the Niagara Peninsula, and this is specifically the area of the Welland Canal, which is shown in red, as well as some other areas that drain directly either to Lake Erie or to Lake Ontario, as well as some areas that drain directly into the Niagara River on their own. So what the main Welland River is, as it shows in the notes there, about 135 kilometers long, with a lot of rural watersheds, and also pockets and areas of urban development associated with the more urban centers. So that's really one of the areas that we specialize in, is determining what areas of those creeks and river systems are flood impacted. So we're going to be talking, as we talked about tonight, about the Beaver Creek and Big Forks Creek, primarily in the towns of Wainfleet and West Lincoln. These are big components of the overall Welland River system. They're two of the major subwatersheds. And they really do encompass a lot of area, each one of them. This is Beaver Creek, of course, and really focusing on the town of Lincoln. And everything in blue that you see there is basically a component of that natural watercourse system. That's a system that, as you can tell by the air photo, it has a lot of farmland in it. That farmland has really changed the landscape away from, say, the forested condition that it used to be in. And that's one of the things I pride my WSP's ability on, is to understand how that system will react to the regulatory storm that Mr. Miller talked about, the 100-year event, to ensure that we are establishing transparently and defensively the ways that, or the extent of that inundation area, that when that water expands out of those blue lines and starts to affect those properties. We are not here to essentially take people's land or inadvertently affect it. We are here to transparently assess what is actually flood impacted and provide that mapping to our partner, the Npca, so that they can apply their policies and regulations appropriately and with the complete assurance that everything has been done according to those rigid standards that Mr. Miller talked about were implemented by the Ministry of Natural Resources. So here's the other subcatchment, the Big Forks Creek catchment. Not a dissimilar kind of system, but a little bit different. It actually has a little bit more involvement from something called municipal drains. Now, municipal drains resemble natural water courses in a lot of ways, but you can see that a lot of those lines are a lot straighter. They tend to follow the road alignments and property lines, and they are governed under a lot of different system called the Drainage Act. And so that has different regulations and policies about how they operate. But from the perspective of floodplain inundations and so on, they still react in very, very similar ways. So to give you an overview of the process, the floodplain model for the Welland River, the Big Forks, and Beaver Creek models follow this kind of process where we really examine the response of the landscape to runoff. Runoff being, you know, what can't soak into the ground, what can't be held on the landscape and allowed to evapotranspire it away, runs across the land, flowing downhill essentially, until it collects in a natural water course or a municipal drain, as the case may be. And it's separate from stream flow. Regular stream flow happens, you know, every day. If you walked out to one of those blue lines on the previous maps on any given day, you would likely see what we call base flow, or in this case, stream flow. Same word, but it means basically the same thing. That would be the normal water flow that you would see. And it's often a combination of things like groundwater discharge. That's actually predominantly in it, but sometimes you get a little bit of localized rainstorms and so on that contribute a little bit. It's a little bit more flashy at the upper ends of the watersheds and a little bit more concentrated and heavier flows once you collect all of that water where it dumps into the Welland River. And so we're trying to establish what area of land is really at risk of that kind of system by establishing what you would see there as those red lines. That's really the extent of the inundation when we have those larger events. So the way we do that actually is we collect a lot of records on stream gauges. We do a lot of work to observe rainfall data to ensure that we're basically going to create a model of this system on our computer systems, and we've got some very fancy ones at our offices. And Albert, my colleague here, is actually quite adept at developing that program. And what it does effectively is it simulates those systems and their response. And we can actually calibrate our model to observe flows. In other words, we have measurements on any of those blue lines that I showed previously, or a select few of them that we know have great confidence in. And we can measure the response directly to certain recorded rainfalls. And we can actually tweak our system, our model system, until we reproduce something that is almost exactly the same response. And then once we've done that and done our checks and balances, we know that we've got a trusted system that if we now extend that analysis out to the 100-year event, we have a very good correlation to where we can expect the water to be. And that's a critical factor in this process, is to make sure that we have it properly calibrated. Otherwise, we have a nice picture of things, but we have no idea if it's actually grounded in reality. And that's something that I want to assure all attendees tonight that we are following with the very, sorry, I'm just trying to work technically at the same time, with the very rigid guidelines that we talked about earlier in the presentation. So, as we said earlier, these systems are made up of a lot of different creeks and watercourses. They have individual branches, and each one of those branches that's within the shaded areas, the ones that we will be examining under this particular program. We'll be examining a lot of the land characteristics, such as the slopes across those surfaces, how far those flow pathways are over the land, and as well as we'll look at the typical types of soils and land uses that we have. Like as we said, there is a fair number of agricultural properties in those particular subwatersheds, but there's also some pockets of urban development and areas that actually respond a little bit differently than a farmer's field would, or a forested area or other natural area. Swamps act in or wetlands act in a certain type as well, and our system is intended to allow for all of that data to be considered when we are establishing those responses. And again, once we have a system that we believe is ready to be tested against those calibration procedures, that's when we have the opportunity to really determine and establish that we have a trusted system here that is really going to give us the proper estimate of the flood impacted areas, and that it's defensible, and that another firm like ours could take our data, reproduce those results, and indicate, especially if they're independent from the whole process, indicate that they agree or disagree with our system. And if they disagree, then we'll have to fix it. That's the long and short of it. And once we have that, we'll be using that to produce our mapping. And then the process by which we do that is, now that we have the model and the flows and the responses from the watershed taken into account, we look at the detailed topography of the watercourse system. We establish basically, in this case, we're going to be establishing cross sections across that watercourse at right angles to the direction of flow. And covering through the contours, we can create the kinds of cross sections you see at the bottom of the screen. And once we have those systems, then we can add things like hydraulic crossings for bridges and culverts and other hydraulic structures that we find in the watershed along those roadways that we talked about. And once we code those into the model, that effect of that crossing will be, it will impact the extent to which the water is predicted to expand out onto the land. So that's really what happens here, is that we find the response upstream and downstream of those crossings all along the entire length of those blue lines that I showed earlier from the satellite view, and we establish the extent to which that water has now responded to our regulatory event. And where we have that, we have those red circles showing you the extent of the flood lines. We then project that back onto the plan view, and we can create something like what you see on the bottom right, which is a flood, like a default or a preliminary floodplain mapping that tells us where we believe the water is going to be according to the model results. And then we will spend a fair bit of time, my technical team and I, to quality check those to make sure that all the processes have been implemented correctly. We will double check all of the hydraulic parameters, such as the opening size of those bridges, what type of materials they are, what kind of sag we have over top of those systems in a roadway sag situation, to make sure that the responses and the impacts of those structures is also incorporated. And that way we really come up with what I believe is a final picture of the floodplain mapping that we can then present to the Npca as something final. Then Steve will put us through the ringer. No doubt about it. Steve is a very well informed technical person, and has had some of the best questions on this process that I've ever had the privilege of working with. And as a result, I believe that this process is going to result in something that is unimpeachable and really will reflect what we truly believe is the extent of flood impacted lands on the landscape, and result in a defensible floodplain map. So thank you for following with me through that. It was a bit technical, I realize that, and I hope it was easy to understand. I'm happy to take any questions about the process later on if you have any. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Steve. Really thank you to the two Steves and to Leilani as well for the informative presentation. If you've joined us in progress, and I know that a number of you have, you've been listening to Npca staff members and their consultant take us through an overview of the initiative. I'm Glenn Pache. I'm the independent facilitator for the session. And thank you again to everyone for participating in today's session, and in particular for your interest in the topic and for the questions that have already been provided. let's move to the questions and the comments now. As they've been submitted, NPCA staff have been reviewing them to identify those that are similar in nature with a view to addressing any duplication. In some cases, they've been consolidating like questions, so please don't worry if the question posed today isn't exactly as it was asked. And again, there may not be time to get to all of the questions this evening, but be assured that NPCA staff will be reviewing them and they will be documented as part of the initiative. So let's get to the questions now. First of all, and Steve Miller, I think maybe this one best goes to you. Someone has started off with a statement saying that the rainfall event on July 17th, 2021 in South Niagara left over 110 millimeters, I assume that's rain, in 12 hours. This is in excess of what Mr. Miller defined as a 100-year event as 100 millimeters in 12 hours. So does this mean that we have experienced something greater than a 100-year event on July 17th? Steve, can you tackle that one for us?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Absolutely. No, thanks for the question. The answer is potentially. Yeah, absolutely, potentially. We know that in intense thunderstorms, very localized thunder showers, very often the intensity is greater than the 100-year event. One of the assumptions we make when we do this kind of floodplain mapping is that that rainfall, that 100 mils, falls across the watershed as opposed to in localized areas. You'll get a big punch of rain. It's an isolated event. If it's not across the watershed, it really wouldn't result in the amount of flooding that we would see on a uniform rainfall. Now, we're fortunate. We're fortunate in this study that the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority owns and maintains 5 rain gauges right in and around the study area. We have one right on Big Forks Creek, Meisner Road. We've got one O'Reilly's Bridge, another one right in Wellandport on the Welland River, stream gauge and rain gauge. And you can see all this information. We collect it and broadcast it. It's on our website. It's near real time. We've got one Caister Center Church Road and one south of Smithville. The take home is we have excellent coverage in terms of figuring out how much precipitation has fallen. And that's one of the things that is very useful to Steve and his team at WSP. When they construct the model, they think, okay, they've got something, they've taken into account the soil type. Now let's run a rainfall through it. We know how much rain fell, let's say at the Big Forks rain gauge at Meisner Road. And we know that during that event, how high the water level got. So we plug that amount of rainfall into WSP's model, the amount of rain, the distribution. It doesn't have to be a 100-year storm, could be whatever. And then let's see what that model predicts is the water level at Meisner Road. That's how we validate, that's how we calibrate our floodplain mapping models. We have real information, real water levels from a real storm event, and we use that to help refine the accuracy of our models.
Great, thanks, Steve. Some more questions for you, and not surprising given the location of the creeks. We have a few questions about agriculture, and I'll put them together so that you can deal with them at once. One individual has said agriculture responds differently to floodplain impacts. Please discuss how a floodplain designation may impact permitted uses within agricultural areas. And somebody else was just asking a very, straightforward question: is farming allowed in a floodplain? So anyway, Steve, if you could tackle those two for us, please.
Thanks, Glenn. I'd be pleased to. Let me assure you that farming and agricultural practices are an allowed use in the floodplain. And the floodplain mapping in no way impedes or impacts an agricultural use. That includes structures associated with a agricultural operation. And so, and we knew that this would be a big concern, especially with the rural nature of these watersheds. So in terms of farming practices, simply having the floodplain designated on these lands will not impact the ability to farm.
Thank you, Steve. So let's get Leilani back in. Leilani, somebody was wondering whether the proposed changes to the Conservation Authorities Act may have an impact on this project, and if so, how so?
Thank you, Glenn. Yes, some of you may have been following that in recent years. There are changes that have already occurred to the Conservation Authorities Act and changes that are still pending to the Conservation Authorities Act, which affect some of our governance roles and mandates and roles and responsibilities. But the one thing that hasn't changed and really through this process has been highlighted as our mandate is our mandate to regulate and manage flood risks within our watershed. So that will not change and that will continue. So we will continue to map and understand the flooding issues within our watersheds and continue to regulate and follow our policies and update our policies related to development within the flood hazards to ensure that we mitigate those risks. So as it stands, we're not removing that mandate. It continues and we continue to have that function moving forward. So thank you for the question.
Thanks, Leilani. Maybe I can go back to Steve Miller on another agriculture-related question. You talked about the ability to continue to farm within the floodplain. Are there any restrictions that would be placed on the placement of farm buildings within the floodplain? Is there anything there that those involved in agriculture need to be thinking about, Steve?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. The Conservation Authority, we work with property owners to understand how they intend to use their property. And part of that, you know, a property owner, their goal is the same as the conservation authorities. We don't want to see their investment, their structure destroyed by natural hazards, in this case, flooding. When the Conservation Authority has floodplain mapping on the property, okay, we better understand the extent and the location of that flood hazard. Just because the floodplain hasn't been mapped on a watercourse or across a property doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So where we have that floodplain mapping, we work with folks to try and direct the location of buildings. Quite often, there are areas, all things considered, you know, it's neither here nor there. This one is potentially flood impacted. This location is not. So that's how we use this information to better inform folks to make a decision. And once again, structures supporting primary agricultural operations, our policies are very flexible with respect to them.
Great, thank you, Steve. Let's get Steve Van Haren back in. Steve, somebody is wondering, and I know you touched on this briefly, has your firm, that is WSP, done a lot of similar projects to the one that you're undertaking here with the Conservation Authority? And do you see this particular study as being somewhat unique, or is it fairly typical from what you've done in the past? Steve?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. There's a lot of similarities to the work that we've done. Yes, we've done this quite a bit. Floodplain mapping, as I said, is one of my team's standard products, and we have quite a well-defined process that I went basically an overview of to establish what the floodplain limits are. So yeah, this program is you know, like we do this in urban areas, we do this in rural areas and so on. There are some unique characteristics to this one. This one has quite a bit more municipal drains, as I talked about. Municipal drains are often associated with flat lands that have special considerations for how far the floodplain goes onto private lands and so on. And so we are considering all of those aspects of it. So yes, there is a standardized process, but the project itself is unique, and the landscape that we're analyzing is quite unique. So we are taking that all into account and being very aware of our responsibility to get this right. This is not something we take lightly, and my team and I are committed to ensuring that the product that we provide is top notch and defensible. So yes, it's unique, but again, it shares a lot of similarities to the work we've done before.
So Steve, a follow-up for you. A couple of times this evening, people have mentioned that the initiative is in its infancy, that it's in its early stages. Some
Yes.
people are wondering, do you take measurements or surveys in the field? Is that something that will be part of your process?
The answer is maybe. The fact is that we have a lot of sources of data. We can access open source data. We can access specific data sets that have been recorded in the past, and so there's a lot of available information that we have access to that is freely available to us, or has been recorded in the past that we can make ourselves aware of. That being said, those sources are can be sometimes dated. There may have been activity going on in the area that may affect our work, and we have to ensure that our product is based on the current conditions. So we, as part of our process, will identify areas that we may need additional data collection on, or additional topography, for instance, or maybe some watershed measurements or watercourse measurements, and new culverts or other type of work. And as the case may be, we'll identify those and discuss with Mr. Miller how to approach those, and ensure that if anything is on private property, we will be talking to those property owners well beforehand to ensure that that the process is transparent, the reasons we're out there, who's going to be out there, and what data we are collecting. And once we have that, we will leave that property. So we are quite aware that most of the information that we require is on public property. And as a result, you'll see us out there, maybe without quite as much notice, but you'll see my team if you're out there with some equipment and a hard hat with a WSP logo on it, and they will be collecting those measurements for those public lands. But I assure you that if anything is missing from the data set that we need to complete our study, we will have a transparent process to collect that, approved and coordinated with the Npca and with the landowners.
So let's go back to Steve Miller, because there's a related question, and it might be too early.
Hey, Glenn?
Yes.
If I can just add on to what Steve had mentioned.
Yeah.
Part of the work program is indeed confirming in the field the crossings, all the major crossings on the municipal roads. So yes, we will be undertaking measurements on those bridges and culverts that on the municipal roads, that in order to make sure that we're using the most up-to-date information.
And Steve, I was actually going to invite you to take this a little bit further, because some people are asking, will you be entering my property? And it may be too early to answer that yet, but did you want to share some additional context on that question?
Absolutely. On first blush, we took a look at the air photos of the study area, and the air photos didn't show us any major structures or crossings or things that could really serve to really throw a wrench into the whole floodplain mapping. There were small farm crossings, and we could see that on the air photos that are typically overtopped and flooded over during a severe storm event, and that's fine. And that, when you get that 100-year storm, that really doesn't impact things one way or another. So our first blush was there's really no need to enter onto private property. But once again, if folks think that hey, there's something unique that this study team needs to know about, give me a call, make contact with me, and we'd be pleased to follow up with you. Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Steve, you showed us some interesting pictures earlier, including an old Corvette, and somebody's wondering, why did it take 30 years to update the Big Forks Creek floodplain map? What's been going on for the last 3 decades?
No, great question. As I mentioned, there's over 140 creeks and rivers and watercourses in the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority's jurisdiction. And since the late 70s, early 80s, the NPCA has been undertaking these floodplain mapping studies. So back in '86, Big Forks Creek was one. There are many other watercourses, though, that don't have floodplain mapping that we try to at least generate something. There are many areas in the peninsula that face development pressure. There are many areas that we know are flood damage centers that are really prone to being impacted by flooding. So we try and prioritize our floodplain mapping program with the staffing and financial resources that we have at our disposal. And so where, for instance, Big Forks, already had floodplain mapping, we turned our attention to, say, other watercourses. Recently, there were some in the town of Grimsby that didn't have any floodplain mapping, urbanized, potential flood damage centers, development pressure. And so it's that kind of thing that we get to. Now, looking at Big Forks, just the main branch had floodplain mapping. A lot of the other tributaries didn't. And with the housing market boom, we're seeing suddenly development pressures, not only in Wainfleet, West Lincoln as well, parts of Eastern Haldimand, and all of Beaver Creek has no floodplain mapping on it. So that was one of the watercourses. It started coming up the list. It was now prioritized. So now's the time. Unfortunately, to update Big Forks, it took 30 years, but there's a lot of priorities on the landscape.
So Steve, maybe you and or your colleague Leilani might want to address this one. It's a pretty general and broad question, but I'm sure you'll have some insight to share. Someone is saying, what should new or recent homeowners take into consideration regarding their potential location within a floodplain? So what do they need to be thinking about? What are some of the issues they need to consider? Do you have any perspective you'd like to share, any thoughts you'd like to share this evening? And Steve or Leilani, either of you, please feel free to kick us off.
Leilani, do you want to?
Sure, I can jump in and feel free to add, Steve. I would suggest if you're a new or recent homeowner and you may be affected by a floodplain, to contact us and discuss what the characteristic of that floodplain is and how it may affect your property. A good resource we have is our online mapping tool, and we do post all our floodplain mapping online, and it is available to the public. So you can search your property and you can see if our current mapping, floodplain mapping, is showing up on your property. And you can definitely contact Steve or our planning department to discuss what that means to you as a homeowner. And some of the things that it may affect is, do you want to put an addition on your house in the future? Do you want to build a deck? Do you want to put in a pool? Do you need new septic system? Some of these actions may require a work permit from the Conservation Authority to ensure that where they're constructed and how they're constructed won't be impacted by that floodplain, or won't have further impact on other properties as a result of this construction and pushing the water around in the floodplain. So I would encourage you, if you think you may be in the floodplain, you can definitely check out our mapping online, and you can definitely reach out and contact us and have a discussion with our staff to better understand what that means on your property. And if you have thoughts on home improvement or construction on your property, to have that discussion with our staff on whether or not you may need a permit in the future when you want to undertake those works. So I don't know, Steve, if you have anything else to add?
Yeah, no, thanks, Leilani. I just, much like you had mentioned, I would encourage folks on our website, everything, all the floodplain mapping that we have, we make available. It's right up there, all the associated reports, freely available. And so you can go on the website and take a look at all the floodplain mapping we've done. If you're a new homeowner, that product might serve to have you dodge a bullet. Let's say you're a new homeowner, just moved in, you find yourself in the floodplain. We have the elevations of those floodplains up there. What that might mean is, well, that basement window in your foundation, you might want to consider maybe a covered window well to kind of safeguard, help prevent flooding during a major storm event. Or if you're thinking about building a garage or a tool shed, that's permitted. Those things are permitted in the floodplain. But if you know where that floodplain is, maybe you want to build your garage on the far side of your house or over here, as opposed to in an area that is going to be wet during a big rain event. So that's a tool that could help the landowner, one, understand the flood hazards on the property and take remedial measures to safeguard, to prevent any damages from happening, whether that be, some home improvement, or that is simply the relocating a thing that you're going to build anyway.
Thanks, Steve. So you and Leilani just talked about the fact that homeowners have access to the existing floodplain maps. Someone is asking more specifically, once this project or this initiative is completed, will landowners be able to view and use the maps from this project? Again, once they're ready. It's probably a simple yes, no, but go ahead, Steve.
Absolutely, Glenn. Absolutely. That's the answer. Once the floodplain mapping is completed, it gets put up on the website. Folks are free to view it, print it out. All the supporting documents, reports, models are freely available for the asking from the Conservation Authority, and we see that a lot when say someone wants to develop a parcel or do something, and they may need a bit of an analysis to determine whether or not there's going to be an impact, rather than starting from scratch. If the Conservation Authority has that floodplain model, it's a fraction of the cost as to what that analysis would undertake otherwise. That model is made freely available.
Great. So Leilani, I know you were probably going to touch on this a little bit later, but someone's asked, so I'll share the question now. This isn't going to be the only public information session. We already said off the top that this is the first of 3. Can you give people just a quick overview of what they can expect in terms of upcoming engagement opportunities through these types of meetings? Like how many more are there, roughly where are they going to be in the process, and so forth?
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you for the question. Yes, we plan on having 2 more public information sessions. So the next one will be in the spring of 2022, and at that time we will be discussing the work that's been completed to that point. We'll be discussing maybe a bit more on what this mapping may be, how this mapping may affect you as a landowner, and a bit of our policies and some discussion around that. And we will continue to answer your questions at that meeting and receive your comments as well. And then moving into the fall of next year, we intend to be in a position where we can start sharing the draft floodplain mapping. So that'll be an opportunity for you to view it, for us to present it and discuss a bit about what the findings have been. And again, hear from you as the landowners and your questions and concerns. So there'll be other opportunities for these information sessions. And throughout the process as well, we have the Get Involved website where you can submit questions. You can contact staff if you wish to discuss something more specific related to your property or your experiences living near the watercourses. So for the full length of the project, we're really here to listen to you and to hear your comments and questions. It's an important component of this project. So we encourage you to get involved. So thanks,
Great.
Glenn.
Oh, thank you. And Steve Miller, let's go back to you. There are a couple of questions relating to the topic of municipal drainage. So let's deal with them together. First of all, somebody has said municipal drainage courses are assessed according to acreage and charged and billed for maintenance of the drains. Will the floodplain mapping generate a charge to the property owner? So that's one question.
Actually, Glenn, let me take
You want
that
to
one.
deal with that one
Yeah,
first?
let me
Sure,
take that
go
one.
ahead.
And the short answer is no. This floodplain mapping exercise will not, I repeat, not result in a bill to maintain that municipal drain. The Conservation Authority MPCA, we understand municipal drains. We understand the Drainage Act. As a matter of fact, we're fortunate to have former drainage superintendent with the Township of Wainfleet in West Lincoln on staff. The Drainage Act and municipal drains are very prescribed things. They have black and white rules around them. And this comment was right. If there's maintenance works, if there's dredging or fixing needed to be undertaken on a municipal drain, that's charged to the folks that drain into that. This floodplain mapping is a different beast. It's not maintenance. It's not work on it. It's a project that the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority is undertaking outside of that act. Okay, it's really to support the Conservation Authorities Act. That's ours. And as such, because it's not a project undertaken pursuant to the Drainage Act, the folks that drain into those watercourses will not see an extra charge on their bill for this project.
That's clarifying. Thank you, Steve. So the related question, if you'd like to take it a little bit further, someone has asked, is there an overlap between municipal drains and Npca regulated floodplains? So is there an overlap or a relationship there? Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Glenn. So municipal drains are constructed under the Ontario Drainage Act, very old piece of legislation. Municipal drains typically, not always, but typically look to provide adequate drainage to support agricultural operations. Now, that drainage, it could be for it's typically for a minor storm event. We talk about the 100-year storm event. There's also 2-year and 5-year storm events. Those are storm events that, let's say, would drop maybe, I don't know, an inch and a half of rain on the landscape. You know, far less rain than the 100-year event. And for the most part, those municipal drains are designed to provide adequate drainage to an agricultural operation or an agricultural community to get that water from those minor storms off the landscape. Quite often, those municipal drains are not designed to completely convey that 100-year storm event. So that's when those municipal drains, similar to watercourses, have, you know, their capacity exceeded. All that water can't be contained in that municipal drain or watercourse, so it spills its banks and flows into the floodplain. So in that respect, a municipal drain acts no different from a natural watercourse in that the lands adjacent to those things are inundated. Water flows across them during a big storm event.
Steve, you and Leilani mentioned that people have access to the mapping. Somebody has asked more specifically, where can they take a look at the existing Big Forks Creek floodplain mapping? So, you know, really practically, how do they get hold of it? Where can they look at it?
Yeah, I can take that, Glenn. So we've got a tool on the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority's website called Watershed Explorer. It's a mapping tool that you simply click on, you navigate around like Google Maps, and you take a look at the floodplain. If folks are having a tough time, my contact information's on the webpage. Feel free to give me a call, email me, and I'd be pleased to help navigate that website, help find your property and whether or not it's impacted by the existing Big Forks Creek floodplain.
Thank you. Let's get Steve Van Haren back in because this is a process-related question. And I know you touched on it, Steve, but somebody's interested in knowing how you know that your model results are in fact accurate. Do you test them? Do you calibrate them in some way? What's the process you go through to ensure that you're getting the best output from the data and from the process?
Great question, Glenn. Yeah, we touched on this a little bit in my presentation, as well as Steve Miller talked about a little bit earlier. But to reiterate that, we have a system here that, as I said, we examine the landscape, the topography, the drainage area that we are examining here. We put into our models those parameters that reflect what type of land we have. Is it agricultural, row cropped? Is it or sharecropped hay, those kinds of things, then and I know that those change and so on, so we have processes to deal with that too. But we look at once we have that sort of system that predicts the flows and the response of the watershed, we route those flows through a simulated model of the water courses themselves. And that was kind of that cross-section areas that I talked about in my presentation. We take those flows and we push them through that system. We can test those against actual recorded responses to various storms that have actually occurred in the watershed at those Npca established rain gauges. If we need more, we can establish more, and we usually do those on public property at additional culverts or other areas where we talk to the owner of those culverts and ensure that they're okay with us putting those in to add more data. So we can increase the resolution. We can work with the resolution that we have now, but that calibration process is an integral part of our study and built right into our work plan to ensure that our model results, when tested against an actual rainfall event, produce a similar response. And that's how we do that calibration process to establish that our model actually reflects real world conditions and is not just an artifact of what we've produced in our office.
Great,
Okay.
thanks, Steve. So a heads up to everybody, we're getting down to our last few questions that have been submitted. So if there is anything urgent and pressing that you would like to get in tonight, and again, it doesn't have to be this evening. There are plenty of opportunities post-meeting to share questions and comments. But if you do have something you want to shoehorn into the meeting this evening, please send it along in the next couple of minutes. But we got a few more things to go through now. And Steve, either of the Steves maybe can jump in on this one. Someone has said, I notice when the Welland Canal is closed in the winter, there is flooding. Is this flooding taken into account with the 1 in 100 year storm events? So either of you, Steve Miller or Steve Van Haren, can you jump in on that one?
Steve, I'll let
Sure.
you take this one first, and then if you need any technical support, I can provide it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. So we got a couple of things going on in the winter. Okay, we've got the Welland Canal does close, but the Welland Canal really doesn't impact what's going on in the Welland River. That's where Beaver Creek and Big Forks Creek drain into. We've got something else going on a little further downstream, and that's how Ontario Power Generation changes their river operation regime. Okay, in the summer, we have more fluctuations in the Welland River itself, and we can talk at length about this. I encourage whoever sent in the question, contact me and we can go through this. That regime changes in the winter. There is not as much more fluctuation. There is a more constant water level in the Welland River, and that could be why you notice a change in the runoff. You see a little bit more flooding in the winter because things are different in the Welland River. That's as a result, not of the Welland Canal, but of what's happening down on the Niagara River, actually.
Okay. Thank you again to both Steves. Steve Miller, this next one is a little bit vague in general, so I'm not sure how you want to treat it, but somebody has said, will any local data be used? And I don't know if by local data they mean municipal data or they mean local data coming from the homeowners or the communities and the neighborhoods, but can you speak to that question, please?
Absolutely, Glenn. So a couple of things. When we talk about local data, we talked about those 5 stream gauges and rain gauges that we have in and around the study area. So that's that very real, very local climate data and stream level data that is used as part of this process. In the past, we've during past floodplain mapping projects, we've got a call from a landowner and said, "Hey, you really want to see this on my property? I don't think it's really showing up, or I don't think you guys know about this for whatever reason." And that's when we come on down at their invitation and take a look. We had one gentleman when we were doing the Welland River was very interested, lived right on the Welland River, was very interested in what the Welland River did in terms of flooding, in terms of its seasonal water levels, so much so that he staked it and said, look, the last winter, the last rain event, the big rain event that we had in the spring came up this high. We came on, surveyed the stakes on that property, and that was another point that we could use to authenticate the accuracy of our model. Just someone, informing us that they had these, they had recorded the flood levels on their property, and we were able to, well, we being WSP in this case, WSP did the Welland River floodplain model, finished that back in 2019. With the input of the Welland River Floodplain Committee. That was a good process. We came up through a couple of things. Public engagement process, notification process that they were happy with, and we're doing the exact same thing going forward, and this is a case in point. So the long answer to your question is yes. If you feel that there's something that the project team should know about, please give us a call and we'd be happy to chat with you.
Great, thanks, Steve. So 2 more questions. One is about next steps. Well, so we'll actually save it until the end because Leilani is going to recap for us next steps and where things go from here in just a couple of minutes. But a very pointed and direct question, Steve. Somebody is asking if a house in the floodplain were to burn down, and hopefully that would never happen, but were it to take place, can it be rebuilt?
Again, the short answer to that, Glenn, would be yes, it can be rebuilt. Now, the Conservation Authority, should we have floodplain mapping? Again, we work with the property owner, and maybe there's an area that's better suited, further away from the flood hazard or less impacted by the flood hazard. But if there was a desire to rebuild on the same foundation, then yes, that is something that is approved or that can be permitted.
Thank you.
We would kind of, with the caveat that we would try and work with the landowner to ensure that all the openings were above the flood hazard. It makes sense. We're in a flood hazard. We know what that height is. We would try to ensure that, say, you wouldn't have a rear yard walkout or windows in the foundation that would allow floodwaters to pour through. So in this case, we would allow the reconstruction, absolutely, but work with the homeowner to inform some floodproofing practices that they could undertake during the rebuild that could better safeguard their new house.
Great. Thank you. So I think we've covered most, if not all, of the questions that have come in this evening, but there may be others that occur to you afterwards, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I wanted to just sincerely thank all of you who did submit your questions. They were very much on point, and I think it was useful for the group as a whole to hear the responses. And thank you to our responders as well. So though we've been focusing on the questions this evening, please keep in mind that you have other options to share both your comments about living in the area and, again, any further questions that might occur to you or any further views that you might want to share. We've mentioned a number of times already that you can visit the project website. We've given you that address. As mentioned, the website will include a Q&A tool that you can use to ask additional questions. There's also that interactive tool that Steve mentioned earlier that you can use to see if your property is in the floodplain mapping study area. And of course, Steve has invited you many times this evening to contact him directly. And again, his email address is smiller, that's MILLER, at npca.ca. And that's the best means of addressing any really specific property related questions or address specific questions that you might have. And again, you can send letters and so forth through email or through surface mail to the NPCA offices. So to be respectful of your time, let's look to wrap things up. And just before I invite Leilani to describe next steps and to share any final thoughts or observations on behalf of the NPCA, again, I wanted to thank all of you for participating, for taking time out of your busy schedules. Again, a special thank you to those of you who took the time to share questions or comments. I'd also again like to thank all of our elected officials and NPCA board members who may have participated this evening, not only for your attendance tonight, but also for your ongoing valued service to the community, which is greatly appreciated. It's been a real pleasure from my point of view facilitating this session with what is obviously a very thoughtful and knowledgeable and articulate group, as made obvious by the questions that were submitted. So thank you again for the privilege of playing that role tonight. I will invite Leilani now to share some quick observations and an overview of next steps. I'll then come back to very quickly wrap things up. We won't keep you for more than another few minutes. Leilani, over to you, please.
Thank you, Glenn. So over the next 6 months, the WSP team will be commencing the work. There may be field work, as they noted. They'll be confirming digital mapping and engineering work. Also, as I noted, the next public information session will be in the spring of 2022, and we'll update the community on the project, findings to date, continue to answer your questions, get into a bit more of a discussion on our policies and how that affects you as a landowner if there's floodplain on your property. In the fall of next year will be the third information session. And as I noted, that will be the time when we can present the draft floodplain mapping to you and to the public, and an opportunity for you to ask questions about that again. So thank you for this evening on behalf of the NPCA and our staff. Thank you for your participation in this session, and thank you for your continuing support. Please, we encourage you to get engaged and get involved. Visit our website, contact Steve. I'm sure his phone and email will be, going off the charts hopefully soon, with people sharing their stories and additional questions and information. And thank you so much for being a part of this important work that we're doing. So back to you, Glenn.
Great, thanks, Leilani. So I won't take more than 30 seconds. Just before we adjourn, again, I want to re-emphasize, we sound a bit like a broken record, but we do encourage you to visit the website, to visit the web page for this project. You can find other information there, and it is a good means of providing additional comments or questions or stories or information that you might want to share. So again, we strongly urge you to do that. I wanted to lastly thank all of the personnel who made this session possible, both content-wise and technical-wise. Your contributions were greatly appreciated. And thank you again to all of you for participating. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Please take care, stay safe, and good night, everyone.